You have never walked into a hospital, a court, a church, a bank, or a corporate headquarters without the building doing something to you before you reach the person you came to see. The entrance sequence, the approach, the threshold crossing. The lobby experience was not designed as a convenience feature. It was designed as a behavioral preparation system, a spatial sequence calibrated to produce a specific psychological state in you before any institutional interaction has occurred. The entrance is not where you arrive. It is where the institution begins to work on you. In 2015, environmental psychologist Colin Ellard published Places of the Heart, the most accessible synthesis of 2 decades of research on how designed environments produce specific psychological states. Ellard's analysis of institutional entrance design documented that every major institutional building category, religious, governmental, financial, medical, educational, deploys a consistent spatial sequence designed to produce the same 3 psychological states: scale reduction of the self, deference activation, and receptivity induction. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how institutional threshold design produces these 3 states, which historical traditions developed the specific spatial sequences that contemporary institutional design continues to reproduce, and why the building you walk into to conduct institutional business has already shaped your psychology by the time you begin that business. The institution meets you at the door. The meeting started before you crossed it. The threshold ritual is one of the oldest documented behavioral technologies in human institutional history. We have examined Arnold van Gennep's tripartite model of ritual transition in our investigation of the graduation ceremony: separation, liminality, and incorporation. The institutional entrance is the spatial implementation of Van Gennep's threshold stage, the designed environment that produces the liminal state in every person who crosses it, preparing them for the institutional interaction that follows. The specific psychological states the institutional threshold is designed to produce have been documented with precision in the environmental psychology literature. The first state is scale reduction, the experience of personal diminishment relative to the institutional environment. The high ceilings, massive columns, oversized doors, and expansive entrance halls of major institutional buildings are not primarily aesthetic choices. They are scale production mechanisms, environmental features calibrated to make the human body feel small relative to the institutional space. Research by psychologist Daniel Batson at Princeton documented that the experience of awe, which scale reduction produces, reliably reduces the subject's sense of personal agency and importance relative to the source of the awe. The institution that produces scale reduction at entry is producing a specific reduction in the subject's sense of personal authority before any institutional interaction has occurred. The second state is deference activation, the heightened tendency to accept rather than challenge institutional authority claims. The spatial vocabulary of institutional authority, elevated authority positions, directional spatial flows that channel movement toward institutional service points, formal material choices that communicate permanence and legitimacy, are each documented in environmental psychology research as producing measurable increases in deference behavior in the people who encounter them. The third state is receptivity induction, the specific cognitive opening that the liminal state produces. We have documented in previous investigations that the liminal state produced by the threshold crossing reduces prefrontal evaluation activity and increases the subject's receptivity to institutional communication. The institutional entrance is designed to produce and extend this liminal state, to keep the subject in the threshold state long enough for the institutional interaction to begin within the receptive cognitive state. The historical traditions that developed specific institutional entrance designs reveal the degree to which the behavioral preparation function was explicitly understood and deliberately operationalized. The Egyptian temple's entrance sequence is the foundational case study. The pylon, the massive gateway structure that marked the boundary between ordinary space and sacred space, was not simply an architectural boundary marker. It was a behavioral preparation sequence. The approach avenue, the pylon gateway, the open courtyard, the hypostyle hall, and the sanctuary formed a progressive spatial sequence that produced progressive scale reduction, progressive deference activation, and progressive receptivity induction in the worshipper moving through it. Egyptologist Erich Hornung documented in his 1982 Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt that the temple's spatial sequence was explicitly understood by its designers as a consciousness preparation technology. Each successive space was designed to produce a specific psychological state as preparation for the next space's requirements. The sanctuary's interaction with the divine could only occur in the psychological state produced by the full entrance sequence. The sequence was the preparation. The preparation was the ritual. The Roman basilica, the administrative and judicial building that became both the model for Christian church architecture and the ancestor of contemporary governmental and financial building design, explicitly transmitted the Egyptian temple's entrance sequence logic to Western secular and religious institutional architecture. Architectural historian Richard Krautheimer documented in his 1965 Early Christian and Byzantine Architecture that the basilica's spatial sequence, the entrance colonnade, the narthex, the nave, and the apse, reproduced the Egyptian temple's progressive spatial preparation sequence in a secular, administrative context. The basilica's worshipper was moved through the same scale reduction, deference activation, and receptivity induction sequence as the Egyptian temple's worshipper, but now in preparation for encountering administrative and judicial authority rather than divine authority. The transmission was not incidental. Christian church architecture adopted the basilica model explicitly because the church's architects understood that the administrative building's behavioral preparation sequence was appropriate for religious purposes as well, that the psychological states the basilica produced were the same states that religious encounter required. Every major Western religious building, governmental building, and corporate headquarters that deploys a formal entrance sequence is reproducing this transmission. The Egyptian temple's behavioral preparation technology, mediated through the Roman basilica, adapted to successive institutional contexts across 2,000 years. Here is where the threshold design analysis produces a precise diagnostic for contemporary institutional encounters. The contemporary institutional entrance deploys the behavioral preparation sequence through 5 specific design elements that have been documented in the environmental psychology and architectural research literature. Wait, look at the structure again. The approach sequence, the designed pathway from the street to the entrance, is the first preparation element. The approach that requires crossing a formal threshold, ascending steps, or passing through a formal gate communicates the boundary between ordinary and institutional space and initiates the separation stage. Research published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology in 2014 documented that approach sequences with formal boundary markers produce measurably higher deference scores in the people who traverse them than equivalent distances without formal markers. The threshold crossing, the moment of entering the building, is the design element most deliberately calibrated for psychological impact. The weight of institutional doors, the transition in acoustic environment, the change in lighting, temperature, and scent are each documented as producing the liminal state's onset. The institutional entrance that produces a dramatic sensory shift at the threshold is the entrance most effectively producing the liminal state. The reception zone, the lobby, waiting area, or entry hall, is the designed space for maintaining the liminal state, while the subject orients to the institutional environment. The reception zone's scale, material vocabulary, visual direction toward authority positions, and acoustic management are each calibrated to extend the liminal state until the institutional interaction begins. The sightline management, the designed control of what is visible and what is concealed at entry, communicates institutional authority through information asymmetry. The subject who can see the authority position but cannot see the full institutional interior is in a spatially subordinate position that reinforces the deference state. The authority position elevation, the raised desk, the elevated judicial bench, the elevated altar, is the design element most directly producing the scale reduction effect through the above eyeline camera relationship we have documented in previous investigations. The subject who looks up to the authority position is in a physically and psychologically subordinate orientation. The pattern does not stop there. The most significant contemporary development in threshold design is the digital threshold, the onboarding sequence, the account creation process, the initial interaction design of digital platforms. We have examined the loading screen, the terms of service, and the notification permission request in previous investigations as elements of the digital threshold. Together, they constitute a digital entrance sequence that reproduces the psychological preparation function of the physical threshold in the digital interaction context. If this investigation is worth continuing, signal it. The algorithm reads that as a vote for independent analysis. Here is the applicable lens. The threshold ritual produces its most powerful effects when it is experienced as the natural spatial design of the institutional building, rather than as a deliberate behavioral preparation sequence. The counter-architecture requires recognizing the entrance sequence as designed. The diagnostic practice. Before entering any major institutional building, identify the specific design elements of the entrance sequence and the psychological states they are calibrated to produce. Which elements are producing scale reduction? Which are producing deference activation? Which are producing receptivity induction? How long does the entrance sequence maintain the liminal state before the institutional interaction begins? Recognizing the design does not eliminate its effects. The scale reduction, deference activation, and receptivity induction produced by the institutional entrance are genuine psychological phenomena produced by the designed environment. But recognizing the design changes your relationship to the psychological states it produces, from a subject being prepared for institutional interaction to an observer watching the preparation occur. That recognition is not a protection against institutional authority. It is a tool for evaluating whether the deference you feel in the institutional encounter is warranted by the specific interaction, or whether it has been installed by the entrance sequence before the interaction began. The next video in this investigation will show you exactly how 3 specific contemporary institutional entrances, a major federal courthouse, a national bank headquarters, and a technology company campus, deploy the 5 threshold design elements, and what the documented behavioral differences are between subjects who have been prepared by the threshold sequence and subjects who have not. Subscribe so you are there when it publishes. The question is not whether every major institution controls the experience of entry through threshold ritual design. Elard's environmental psychology research, Hornung's Egyptian temple analysis, and Krautheimer's basilica transmission documentation all confirm that they do. The question is which threshold sequence you will cross next, and whether you will notice what it is doing to you before you reach the person you came to see. This investigation was produced with AI-assisted research tools and human editorial oversight. All claims are grounded in documented historical and institutional sources. Transparency is part of the methodology.